It was exactly 3:14 in the morning when the scratching started on the inside of my bedroom wall, right where the old lath and plaster meets the brick. That wouldn't have been so bad if my grandfather hadn't passed away in that exact room 3 days earlier. But what makes it truly terrifying is that the scratching was rhythmically tapping out the old short trench code he used to mumble in his sleep when his night terrors came back from the Western Front. There was a wet, heavy thud against the floorboards directly beneath my bed. It sounded exactly like a soaked wool trench coat hitting the mud. If someone was down in the crawl space, they had to have crawled through 60 feet of jagged stone and broken glass in total darkness, and I was entirely alone in a house that sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road. How long had they been down there waiting for me to turn off the lights? My name is Arthur, and in the fall of 1974, I inherited my grandfather's homestead in the deep timber of northern Maine. Grandfather had served in the infantry during the First World War, and when he came back in 1919, he didn't want to see another human face if he could help it. He bought 200 acres of dense, unforgiving pine woods and built a small, 4-room house entirely by hand. He lived there for over 50 years, completely isolated, growing his own food and cutting his own firewood. As he got older, his mind started to slip backward into the past. My parents couldn't handle his sudden outbursts or the way he would suddenly drop to the floor when a thunderstorm rolled in, so the duty of caring for him in his final years fell to me. I didn't mind it at first. The woods were quiet, almost entirely silent most days, save for the wind through the high canopy. But the house itself always felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Grandfather spent his last months confined to a small bedroom at the back of the house, staring out the single window that faced the dense treeline. He rarely spoke to me in English toward the end. Instead, he would mutter strings of numbers, names of guys he used to know in the mud of France, and names of places that sounded like choking sounds. He died quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday, and after the undertaker's truck left, the silence of the woods rushed in to fill the void he left behind. The first night alone was when the atmosphere shifted. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived deep in the forest, but the woods have a specific volume. Usually, you can hear the faint rustle of nocturnal animals, the occasional snap of a dry twig under a deer's hoof, or the hoot of an owl. But that night, the silence was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating kind of quiet that makes your ears ring because your brain is straining so hard to find a sound. I tried to keep busy by cleaning out his personal belongings. In the living room, next to his old rocking chair, sat a heavy wooden trunk that he had kept padlocked for as long as I could remember. The key had been around his neck when he died, and I had slipped it into my pocket. When I finally turned the lock and lifted the heavy lid, the smell of old wool, mothballs, and damp earth hit me so hard I had to take a step back. Inside were his old military uniforms, a pair of worn leather boots that were still caked with 50-year-old European dirt, and a stack of leather-bound journals. I sat on the floor by the light of a single oil lamp and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat at first, detailing his training and his arrival in Halifax. But as the dates moved into late 1917, the script became frantic, jagged, and heavily smeared. He wrote about a specific sector near a village that had been shelled into nothing but red dust. He didn't write about the Germans or the artillery, though. He wrote about the spaces between the lines. He wrote about the no man's land that existed at night when the flares weren't up. One entry, dated November 14th, 1917, caught my eye. He wrote, "The mud doesn't just swallow the dead. It changes them. We left Miller out there 3 days ago when the sniper took him. Tonight, we heard him calling from the wire. But Miller's jaw was shot away on Tuesday. Whatever is calling out there is using his voice to try and make us look over the parapet. The captain says if anyone looks, he'll shoot them himself. It's not Miller. It's the thing that lives under the wood." I let out a shaky breath and closed the book. It was classic shell shock, the tragic delusions of a young man traumatized by the horrors of industrialized warfare. I told myself that to calm my racing heart, but then I noticed something strange on the floorboards beneath the trunk. There were deep, deliberate scratch marks in the wood, as if someone had been dragging something incredibly heavy back and forth across the floor over a period of years. The marks led directly toward the small access hatch that opened into the crawl space beneath the house. By midnight, the temperature inside the house dropped significantly, far lower than it should have for an autumn evening. I could see my own breath forming white plumes in the living room. I went to the wood stove to stoke the fire, but when I opened the iron door, the coals were completely black and cold, despite me having put 3 thick logs of seasoned oak in there just an hour prior. The wood hadn't burned, it looked charred and decayed, as if it had been sitting at the bottom of a swamp for a decade. That was when I heard the first external sound. It came from the edge of the woods, right outside Grandfather's bedroom window. It was a low, wet whistling sound. It wasn't the wind. It had a rhythmic, lung-powered quality to it, like someone trying to whistle a tune through a mouthful of water or fluid. It was an old wartime melody, one that Grandfather used to hum under his breath when he was particularly agitated. I froze, holding the iron poker in my hand. My body instinctively told me to stay perfectly still, a primal survival instinct screaming that if I didn't move, whatever was outside wouldn't see me. The whistling stopped abruptly. A second later, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the house from the treeline. These weren't normal footsteps. A man walking through the woods breaks twigs and rustles leaves. This sound was heavy, wet, and dragging. It sounded like someone dragging a massive, waterlogged sack of laundry through the brush. Schlich, drag, schlich, drag. It moved with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate pace, coming closer and closer to the back wall of the house. I crept toward the kitchen window, which gave a partial view of the backyard and the woodpile. The moon was bright, casting long, distorted shadows through the pine trees. I pressed my face against the glass, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. For a long time, I saw nothing but the silver-lit trunks of the trees. Then, near the old well house, a shadow moved. It didn't move like a person. It was hunched over, incredibly low to the ground, its limbs moving in an awkward, uncoordinated sprawl, as if it didn't quite understand how human joints were supposed to function. It was wearing what looked like a tattered, dark coat that hung off its frame in shreds, dragging in the dirt behind it. It stopped near the well, and then it slowly tilted its head upward toward the sky. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face, and my stomach instantly turned to ice. There were no features. Where the eyes and nose should have been, there was only a smooth, pale mass of distorted flesh, covered in what looked like dried, black-crusted mud. But the mouth was wide open, a dark, jagged cavity that didn't have teeth, just a hollow emptiness. From that cavity, the wet whistling sound began again, louder this time, vibrating through the glass of the window pane right in front of my face. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, a terrifying understanding that made my knees go weak. This thing wasn't an intruder, and it wasn't an animal. This was what my grandfather had been running from his entire life. He hadn't built this house in the middle of nowhere to escape society. He had built it here because he thought the vastness of the woods could hide him from whatever had followed him home from the trenches of France. It had taken 50 years, but it had finally tracked his scent to this isolated ridge. And now that he was gone, the house belonged to me, and the thing outside knew it. The whistling stopped, and the creature suddenly dropped completely flat into the high grass, vanishing from sight. A split second later, a massive impact rattled the back of the house. The entire structure shuddered on its stone foundations. The sound didn't come from the door or the window. It came from beneath the floorboards. Whatever it was had thrown itself into the narrow crawlspace clearance underneath the kitchen. I dropped the iron poker, my hands shaking so violently I could barely control them. The sound of dragging began again, but this time it was directly beneath my feet. I could hear the rough fabric of that tattered coat scraping against the underside of the floorboards, moving slowly from the kitchen, through the short hallway, and straight toward the back bedroom where Grandfather had spent his final days. I backed up into the center of the living room, staring at the closed door of that bedroom. The floorboards in there began to creak and groan under an immense, shifting weight. I could hear a wet, raspy breathing sound filtering through the gap at the bottom of the door, accompanied by the distinct smell of stagnant water, rot, and old iron. It smelled exactly like a battlefield excavation site. Then came the scratching. It was a sharp, rhythmic clicking against the inside of the bedroom wall. Dot, dash, dot. It paused. Then it repeated, over and over. My mind flashed back to the journals I had just been reading, to the passages where my grandfather described the trench codes used by his unit when the telephone lines were cut by artillery fire. The code it was tapping out wasn't a random series of noises. It was a specific signal. It was the signal for position compromised. requesting immediate extraction. The creature was using my grandfather's memories, or perhaps the remnants of what it had taken from him, to communicate with me. It was trying to entice me to open that door. "Arthur?" The voice didn't come from the bedroom. It came from the darkness right behind me, whispered directly into my left ear. It was my grandfather's voice, perfectly replicated, down to the slight gravelly rasp of his old age, but it was completely devoid of any human emotion or inflection. It sounded like a tape recording being played back at a slightly incorrect speed. I spun around, screaming, and swung my fists into the empty air. There was no one there. The living room was empty, but the air was so cold now that my skin felt like it was being pricked by hundreds of tiny needles. The oil lamp on the table flickered violently, the flame turning a sickening shade of dull green before sputtering out completely, plunging the house into pitch blackness. In the dark, all my other senses became painfully acute. I could hear the wet, dragging sound moving back out of the bedroom, coming down the hallway toward the living room entrance. The floorboards groaned in a slow, steady progression. 5 feet away, 4 feet away. I didn't think. I didn't plan. Survival took over completely. I lunged blindly to my right, my hands crashing against the cold iron handle of the front door. I threw the latch open and sprinted out into the night, not even bothering to close the door behind me. I ran down the dirt driveway, my bare feet cutting open on the sharp gravel and pine needles, but I didn't feel the pain. I didn't look back. I knew that if I looked back, if I saw whatever was coming out of that front door after me, my brain would simply refuse to function, and I would stop running. I ran through the pitch-black woods for what felt like hours, guided only by the faint silver light of the moon filtering through the high pine branches, until I finally reached the state highway. I collapsed on the asphalt, shivering, bloody, and screaming for help until a passing log truck driver spotted me in his high beams around 5 in the morning. He thought I had been attacked by a bear or a drifter. He drove me straight to the county hospital, where they treated me for severe hypothermia and deep lacerations on the soles of my feet. The police went out to the property later that afternoon to investigate what they assumed was a violent home invasion. They found the front door wide open, just as I had left it. The house was completely empty. They didn't find any signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside, and no evidence of anyone having been in the crawl space. But the deputy who took my statement told me one thing that made me realize I could never go back there again. He said that when they walked into my grandfather's old bedroom to check the premises, they found the heavy wooden trunk sitting in the middle of the room, completely empty. The uniforms, the boots, and the journals were gone. And on the wall right above the bed, written in thick, dried Black River mud that was still damp to the touch, were 3 letters scratched deep into the plaster. OUT. It's been 2 years since that night. I sold the land to a commercial timber company for a fraction of what it was worth, under the strict condition that I would never have to set foot on the property again. The company put up heavy iron gates and no trespassing signs, and as far as I know, nobody has been up that ridge since. But I haven't slept a full night since then. I moved to a high-rise apartment building in the middle of the city, surrounded by concrete, bright streetlights, and the constant, comforting roar of traffic. I thought the noise and the distance from the woods would keep me safe. But last night, around 3 in the morning, the city traffic suddenly went completely dead. The streetlights outside my 10th floor window flickered and turned a strange, dull shade of green. And then, from the inside of the drywall right behind my headboard, I heard it. A faint, wet, rhythmic scratching, tapping out 3 short clicks, 3 long clicks, and 3 short clicks. It wasn't a request for extraction this time. It was just waiting for me to turn off the lights.